Our defence correspondent Jonathan Beale reports from Mosul.
Our Africa editor Mary Harper reports.
Let's go to Hong Kong now. Time for business news. On our business desk is Andrew Wood.
Available on the BBC iPlayer radio app. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Welcome to the inquiry on the BBC World Service. I'm Ruth Alexander. Pope Francis is being accused of encouraging un-Catholic views.
It's accusing him of spreading heresy.
The controversy focuses on whether people who have divorced and remarried should be able to receive communion, a ritual that is central to the Catholic faith.
Being in that state of sin means that one cannot receive communion, even if it's blunt and harsh to say it as clearly as that.
People enter and exit relationships somewhat flippantly. The Church stood as this prophetic voice to not do that.
Many say Pope Francis is a modernizer.
In order to bring people to Jesus Christ, you have to get involved in the messiness of people's lives.
But others say his job is to uphold the faith, not to change it. So we're asking, is the Pope Catholic? That's the inquiry after the news.
Hello, this is Charles Carroll with the BBC News. The United Nations says of the forced displacement of civilians, mainly Kurds, in northern Iraq. Iraqi government forces have advanced into areas formerly controlled by the Kurdish authorities following a referendum on Kurdish independence. Here's Alan Johnston.
The UN says it's heard of armed groups burning about 150 homes around the city of Tuz Hormatu on Monday and Tuesday. There were also reports of houses belonging to Kurdish political officials being dynamited. This comes against the background of a complete transformation of the security situation in the region. Moves by the Kurds to break away from the rest of Iraq gave rise to serious tension. This led to the Iraqi military moving in and taking over some disputed, multi-ethnic areas where Kurdish forces had been in control.
The European Council President, Donald Tusk, has said there's no space for the EU to get involved in mediation over Catalonia. He was speaking on the first day of an EU summit and said the crisis over the region's bid for independence would not be widely discussed by European leaders. Speaking at a joint news conference with the President of the EU Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, Mr Tusk rebuffed Catalan appeals for mediation.
I am, of course, for many reasons, in permanent contact with Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy. There is no hiding that the situation in Spain is concerning, but our position, I mean the institutions and member states are clear. There is no room, no space for any kind of mediation or international initiatives or action.
The Spanish government on Thursday said that it would start a process to take over some of Catalonia's autonomous powers. The regional leader, Carles Puigdemont, has threatened to ratify independence if it does. Hundreds of people have marched at the University of Florida in the United States to protest against a speech being given by Richard Spencer, a far-right white nationalist. With a heavy police presence, the Florida marchers wielded signs saying "Love, not hate," and chanted "Stand up, fight back." One of them accused Mr Spencer, who organised the rally in Charlottesville in August in which a protester died, of harking back to the 1960s. Meanwhile, a neo-Nazi website urged the right-wingers' supporters to stage flash mobs at local sites, including Jewish and black cultural centres. President Trump says he believes Republicans in the US Senate will today approve a budget measure that'll make it easier to bring in sweeping tax cuts later this year. If passed, this initial measure will mean later tax legislation can be approved by a simple Senate majority, rather than the 60 votes out of 100 that it currently needs. Mr Trump's proposed overhaul will include a drop in the corporate tax rate and income tax rates for most earners. World News from the BBC. Rwandan politicians have reacted unusually strongly to a recent report by Human Rights Watch in which the campaign group accused the Rwandan military of unlawful detentions and torture. The Parliament and Senate held a joint session in which they denounced the organisation and denied its accusations. Attempts to resolve a growing electoral crisis in Kenya do not appear to have made progress ahead of next week's rerun of August's presidential poll. The opposition leader, Raila Odinga, met the head of the Electoral Commission and reportedly asked him to postpone the election. Anne Soy reports from Nairobi.
President Uhuru Kenyatta remains on the campaign trail, keen to take part in the fresh election on Thursday next week. In a tweet, the president says there will be no sitting in boardrooms to negotiate and share government. The Electoral Commission's chairman, Wafula Chebukati, remains optimistic, even after announcing that it was difficult to guarantee a credible election. Opposition leader Raila Odinga has withdrawn his candidature and called for mass protests on election day. The country is in limbo.
Journalists in Malta have protested outside the courts of justice in Valletta after an investigative reporter delving into alleged high-level corruption was killed by a car bomb on Monday. They filed an application urging detectives to ensure that Daphne Caruana Galizia's sources remain protected. The journalist said the attack would not muzzle them or stop them fulfilling their role as watchdog. The Maltese government said that police believe the bomb under her car was triggered remotely. And a Spanish tourist in Florence has been killed by a falling stone fragment in one of the Italian city's main churches. It happened in the Basilica di Santa Croce, which is the burial site of luminaries including Michelangelo, Galileo and Machiavelli. Officials said it appeared that a marble capital from the top of one of the columns got dislodged, causing the death of the man who was in his 50s. Police have closed the church. BBC News.
Welcome to The Inquiry on the BBC World Service with me, Ruth Alexander. Each week we bring you 4 expert witnesses answering one pressing question from the news. On August the 11th this year, the Pope received an unusual delivery. A Pope hasn't received something like this, apparently, since the 1300s. Most Holy Father, the letter began, in Latin. With profound grief, it read, we are compelled to address a correction to your holiness on account of the propagation of heresies. The 25-page letter accused the Pope of allowing the spread of un-Catholic views. A staggering allegation to make to the person who has supreme authority in the Church. The letter was signed by 62 theologians and priests, and was also posted online, where it's gathered more signatures, becoming effectively an online petition. With such a public questioning of the Pope's commitment to the faith he leads, we're asking, is the Pope Catholic?
Part 1. Doubts and Corrections.
It's about the size of an 18-hole golf course, the actual Vatican City state.
The Vatican is where our first expert witness, Christopher Lamb, spends much of his time as Rome correspondent for the Catholic news magazine, The Tablet. Vatican City is the smallest independent state in the world, and it's where you'll find the headquarters of the Roman Catholic Church.
That's all housed in Renaissance glory, Renaissance palaces, so you go in to meet people there and you walk past the first maps painted by Dante, and it's like you feel the sense of history and it's kind of overwhelming. But then you have a more modern part of the Vatican City State, which is where Pope Francis lives in this residence, the Casa Santa Marta, and that's like a 3-star hotel kind of place.
The Pope lives there in just 2 rooms. He could have a grand apartment on the top floor of a palace. Popes normally do. But this Pope prefers a more modest lifestyle, to be less supreme, more ordinary. And it was that interest in the lives of ordinary people that prompted him, a couple of years ago, to invite bishops from all over the world to come to Vatican City to discuss church teaching on the family.
Pope Francis wanted to ensure that the Church is closer to the everyday realities of family life.
On the table for bishops to discuss were a range of controversial topics: contraception, gay marriage, divorce, and Pope Francis wanted real debate.
He has a phrase that says, it's okay for the plates to fly.
One of the most divisive issues was what to do about people who have divorced and remarried.
In church understanding, there can be no divorce for a couple who are validly married in the church's eyes. So if you have a situation where a marriage has broken down and someone remarries, in the church's eyes, that remarriage is an adulterous relationship. It is deemed to be a mortal sin.
If you've divorced and remarried, you're still allowed to attend church services, but you're not allowed to take part in a ritual that is central to the Catholic faith, Holy Communion, a reenactment of Jesus Christ's Last Supper, where churchgoers go up to the altar and are given bread and wine, believing that in doing so, they're sharing in the body and blood of Christ.
Communion is the source and summit of being a Catholic. The main reason to be a Catholic, in many ways, is to be able to receive communion. Once you can receive communion, you are part of the church.
So when everybody else in the pews gets up, goes to the front to receive the bread and the wine, people who have divorced and remarried have to stay seated, wait till that part of the service is over.
Yes, the sort of back of the pew Catholics.
Believers who attend church services but are unable to participate fully in the heart of it.
I think the Pope and a number of bishops saw that these Catholics were kind of stuck.
Following the big debate on the family, the Pope issued a document, which was a summary of all the discussions with, because he's Pope and in charge, a little bit of his own spin. He called it Amoris Laetitia, which is Latin and means the joy of love. The document contains more than 200 pages of his thoughts and directions for the Church on family life, and, towards the end, one explosive footnote.
He basically hinted or suggested that divorced and remarried Catholics can, in some circumstances, receive the sacraments.
Sacraments include that central ritual, communion. The Pope's wording left room for interpretation. He didn't say it directly, but he seemed to be suggesting that in certain cases it would be okay for people who have divorced and remarried to receive communion. Some very senior figures in the Church issued a challenge.
4 cardinals issued a series of questions to the Pope known as dubia, which means doubts in Latin, demanding clarification on certain points.
The Pope didn't respond. And so came the next challenge, that letter sent to the Pope in August suggesting he was encouraging un-Catholic views.
It's accusing him of spreading heresy. It's not accusing him personally of being a heretic. I mean, that would be an extraordinary charge, but it is going about as close as you can to that, and it's saying that he is allowing heretical views to spread in the Church by basically being too ambiguous on this question of whether or not divorced and remarried Catholics can receive communion.
Again, the Pope didn't respond, and the criticism of Pope Francis isn't confined to obscure Latin documents. There's been a poster campaign in Rome, and spoof news articles poking fun at his refusal to answer his critics.
So the Pope almost being trolled on his home turf.
And beyond.
This is a debate that has spilled out into the Twitter sphere, across social media. It really has become a massive discussion that's been going on online as well as amongst people at the highest levels of the Church.
A debate that started out as a question of whether divorced and remarried people should receive communion has revealed a deep division within the Church over what is and isn't Catholic, with questions being raised about whether even the head of the Church has got it right.
Part 2. Objective Reality.
It's quite incredible. We have a direct view of the valley which runs downwards from the monastery, and then on the other side there are two. It's quite incredible. We have a direct view of the valley which runs downwards from the monastery, and then on the other side there are 2 mountains which dominate the whole of this area of Italy.
To get an idea of why the Pope's infamous footnote has caused such unease in some parts of the Church, we've brought you to a mountaintop monastery.
It is absolutely stupendous. It is definitely worth coming here to visit.
It's where our second expert witness, Ben Harnwell, runs a think tank, Dignitatis Humanae Institute, which aims to exert Christian influence on public life. He converted to Catholicism about a decade ago.
I came to the belief that the claims that the Catholic Church made about itself were actually true.
Catholics believe their faith is founded on the teachings of Jesus Christ, and Ben Harnwell says that makes its teachings true and unchanging.
Christ, God, doesn't change. So if these teachings, which come from Christ 2,000 years ago, come to us because they represent the original divine intention for mankind, if that was true 2,000 years ago, then it's certainly true today.
And that faith in the unchanging truth of Catholicism is why some Catholics cannot entertain the idea that anyone who's divorced and remarried should receive communion.
Being in that state of sin means that one cannot receive communion, even if it's blunt and harsh to say it as clearly as that. But that is the objective reality, because we are talking here fundamentally with objective reality.
Objective reality means the truth is absolute and the rules cannot be bent for the individual. You can imagine somebody who's divorced through no fault of their own. Perhaps their husband or wife was unfaithful, perhaps they abused them. You know, they're left on their own with children, and then they meet somebody else who they fall in love with, someone who they can form a partnership with to help look after the children. They remarry. Should those people really be frozen out of the heart of the Catholic Church ceremony, communion?
The only possible basis that the Church can answer that question is by looking at objective reality and then proceeding from there. Not what people want to think, not what is comfortable for people to think, but what is the actual objective reality.
So if that's how some conservative Catholics think, you can understand why the Pope has caused upset by seemingly suggesting that things aren't so cut and dried, that divorced and remarried Catholics might be able to receive communion. Ben Harnwell points out that he hasn't signed the petition accusing the Pope of allowing heresy, and that his think tank takes no view on the issue. However, he understands the arguments the Pope's critics are making. Isn't the Pope on earth the ultimate authority in the Church? Doesn't what he say go?
Looking precisely at the Pope's authority is essential here. The Pope's authority is to safeguard the integrity of the faith. It's not to change the faith.
And if a Pope is considered to not be safeguarding the faith, what happens then? How far can the criticisms go?
There aren't a great many precedents from history to know quite how this might play out. It is possible, and I have absolutely no way of knowing, that the next stage would be for the critics to then move to suggesting that there is formal heresy.
An accusation of formal heresy would be asserting that the Pope is knowingly departing from the Catholic Church's teachings. What would happen then? Should the Pope be worried?
I think the vast majority of people, they would stay loyal to the Pope. I think what is more likely to happen is that bishops, having declared the Pope formally a heretic, would probably move to offering some kind of oversight for those Catholics who no longer recognised Pope Francis as Pope. Nobody wants them to move in that direction. Certainly not I.
It is possible then that this argument could lead to a schism or split in the Roman Catholic Church. That sounds